Story 1. A dog named Lucky. In 2014, a 32-year-old woman named Julia made a choice she would remember for a long time. Julia was a volunteer at an animal shelter in Madison, Wisconsin. For more than a year, she helped care for lost or abandoned animals. He was so kind and patient, especially with animals that had been hurt or abused. But helping one dog at the shelter was harder than helping any other. The dog was a wolfhound German Shepherd mix. He looked lost and was very big and strong. His name was Duke. Duke had an intense presence and many of the people around him were nervous. The shelter workers noticed something was off about him. When families adopted him, they returned him after only a few days. Some families said he was difficult to handle, while others said he scared them. Julia thought Duke just needed a little more care and attention. So she decided to take him home for a while to see if that would help. One cold November evening, Julia brought Duke into her small, one-room home. She provided him with a comfortable bed, food, and water. Duke seemed comfortable with her, more comfortable than he had been at the shelter. He was calm and alert, and Julia kept him on schedule. After a few days, Duke seemed settled and there were no problems. But one night, something strange happened. Later that Friday, Tom, Julia's ex-boyfriend, showed up at her door. Julia and Tom had broken up a few months earlier. He had been to her house several times before, and those visits had always been tense. But this time he seemed even angrier than before. You could tell by his voice that he was very nervous. Julia didn't open the door. Instead, he said he was busy and didn't want to talk. Tom wouldn't leave, though. He started screaming and banging on the door. Duke stood, his body tense, his eyes fixed on the door. Then Julia heard the doorbell ring. Tom was trying to get in. Suddenly, Duke started at the door. He let out a deep, high-pitched growl Julia had never heard before. It was powerful and ferocious. She could hear Tom stop on the other side, muttering something to himself. Then, as soon as he arrived, Tom ran down the stairs and disappeared into the night. Julia calmed down, but she was also shaken by the incident. Then she noticed something strange. When she finally opened the door to check if Tom was gone, Duke was nowhere to be found. Not long ago he had been standing beside her. Now he was gone. He searched her small house, called her name, but there was no sign of her. He went outside, but couldn't see him anywhere. After about an hour, he gave up and went to bed, but he still felt uneasy. At 3 in the morning, Julia woke up to find Duke lying at the foot of the bed, sound asleep, as if he had been there the whole time. She hadn't heard him come back in and had no idea how he got back. In the morning, she saw muddy footprints leading from her front door to her room. For the next few days, Julia couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Duke acted like a normal dog during the day, but at night, he would sometimes disappear. She tried to follow him one night when he walked out the door, but he was too fast. Duke moved into the woods behind her house and left until he caught up with her. However, he came home every morning and lay by her bedside or waited by the door. About a week later, Julia was unexpectedly visited by her neighbor, an elderly woman named Mrs. Henson. Mrs. Henson rarely spoke to Julia, but now she seemed worried. He said he had seen a large figure near Julia's house at night. At first he thought it was a predator, but then it looked closer. He said it looked like a giant dog or maybe even a wolf. Julia knew Duke was big, but her neighbor's description didn't quite fit her. Mrs. Henson described the figure as standing on 2 legs and having strange yellow eyes. He warned Julia to keep the doors locked at night. Julia tried to shoo him away, thinking that her neighbor might mistake the Duke for something else. That evening, Julia heard a scratch on her window. When she looked outside, she saw nothing. The next morning, she found scratches on the outside of the window frame. It was probably a raccoon or some other wild animal, she thought. But she felt uneasy and wondered if it had anything to do with Duke. The strangest thing happened the next Friday. Julia came home from work and Duke was waiting by the door. This was unusual because he hadn't been out at all when she got back. Even stranger was that his coat was covered in dirt and he had long fresh scratches on his face and legs, as if he had been in a fight. Julia examined him and found no serious injuries. Duke looked tired, but he didn't act like anything was wrong. That night, Julia sat with Duke at his feet and thought about everything that had happened. Duke had protected her from the tribe, scared away other potential threats, and seemed to have a way of disappearing and reappearing without a trace. Julia didn't know who Duke was or if he was just a dog, but she felt safe with him. Julia decided to keep Duke forever and gave him a new name, Lucky. Tom was never seen again after that night. There were no more strange noises outside her window and her house was quiet. Stephen's commentary on camera, me, Segway Story 2 Gravity Gone Wrong in Rockwell, Texas, on June 14, 1995, a man named Hank said he witnessed something truly strange. Hank, a middle-aged mechanic, lives with his wife Linda and several pets. He had a parrot named Sparky and a German shepherd named Buddy. Hank insisted that he and his family were part of an event that seemed impossible. According to him, it violated the laws of nature. Hank was sitting in his living room one afternoon. He saw a bright object in the sky. It didn't look like a helicopter, and it wasn't an airplane. The object fell on the house in complete silence, then disappeared in an instant. Hank wasn't too worried about it, thinking it might be a new type of aircraft. But an hour later, Hank saw something incredible. His wife and their pets were walking on the roof. They weren't swimming. The roof seemed to be their floor. Hank watched as Buddy paced up and down the ceiling, tapping his claws gently on the top. The sparkling parrot landed upside down on the ceiling fan. Linda stood near the light, looking as confused as Hank felt. Hank's feet were planted firmly on the floor. Gravity was working naturally for him. He reached up, trying to grab onto the netting, but he couldn't get close. It was as if an invisible wall was keeping him grounded while Linda and the pets moved freely above him. Hank felt trapped. He didn't understand what was happening. Linda clearly couldn't get down and Hank couldn't reach her. He was walking in slow circles, looking as lost as she was. Spark chirped quietly, looking at Hank. Hank sat on the floor and stared at his wife and pets on the ceiling for over an hour. Every few minutes he would stop and try to reach them, but something would hold him back. Buddy would often stop to sit or bark, and Sparky would stay by the ceiling fan cage. Hank decided to check every room for answers. He looked in the kitchen, the bedroom, and out. There was nothing out of the ordinary in the rest of the house. When he got back to the living room, Linda was still on the ceiling. Buddy was lying next to him, his tail slapping the plaster. Hank wondered if he should try to break the ceiling to get to them, but he figured that would just make things worse. After a while, Hank realized he couldn't figure it out on his own. He decided to get help. He took some pictures to show what he was seeing. He figured no one would believe him without proof. So he called the police. When the dispatcher answered, Hank explained that his family and pets were trapped in the ceiling. About 20 minutes later, 2 officers arrived. Officer Blake and Officer Sanchez entered Hank's home, looking confused and unsure. Hank led them into the living room, but after that everything seemed normal. Linda and the pets were back where they should be. Hank pointed to the ceiling and told the officers what had happened, begging them to believe him. The officers looked around the room and examined every part of the ceiling. They exchanged a suspicious look and asked Hank if he was okay. Hank claimed that just a few minutes ago, Linda, Bud, and Spark were upside down on the ceiling as if some strange force had taken over the room. The officers examined Hank's photos. The photos showed what he described, but the officers had no way of confirming if the photos were real or if something unusual had happened. They told Hank that it could be an illusion or a trick of the light. But Hank was convinced by what he saw. He knew that his wife, Bud, and Spark were definitely on the roof. Hank pointed to the ceiling and told the officers to look for footprints. The officers went up to check on him, and what they found left them speechless. The ceiling had footprints that looked exactly like ribbon, tiny bird prints that looked like Spark's claws, and faint shoe-shaped marks that matched Linda's soles. The officers didn't know what to think. Upon closer inspection, they saw more footprints than expected. They counted at least 10 paw prints from Buddy, several small bird prints, and several shoe prints from Linda. The marks were clearly visible, scattered all over the ceiling in different directions. The officers looked at Hank in surprise and confusion. They couldn't explain how they got the marks, but they couldn't deny what they were seeing. Officer Sanchez took out a small flashlight and looked closely at the ceiling. Hank asked if they could check other rooms, so Hank showed them around the house. The ceilings in all the other rooms were clean. It was only in the living room that they found these strange marks. Officer Blake took notes, recording what they saw and noting where each print was. Hank waited while they examined everything. He asked them if they believed now, but the officers didn't answer. Instead, they stared at the ceiling. They didn't want to say anything until the end of the investigation. After a few more minutes, they filmed the ceiling themselves with their own cameras. When they were done taking pictures, they checked the floor for similar marks, but found nothing. Everything on the floor looked normal. There were no strange footprints, footsteps, or bird tracks on the ground. The officers exchanged nervous glances, unsure of what to do. Officer Blake suggested that they might need more help to solve the mystery. Finally, the officers decided to go and report what had happened. They told Hank they would report it as a strange but unconfirmed event. They promised to return if they found out more information. They advised Hank to contact them if anything unusual happened. When the officers left, they were still looking at the house. Hank stands at the door and watches them leave, still thinking about the strange afternoon. He has no idea why this happened or if it will happen again. The officers take one last look and then run off, leaving Hank to wonder what really happened that day. Stephen's commentary on camera, Me, Segway Story 3. The Watcher. In July 2005, the family moved to a new home in Rockford, Illinois. It was a two-story house with a big yard. Sarah, the mother, loved the bright kitchen. Mike, the father, loved the tall windows. Their 7-year-old son, Tommy, loved his room on the second floor facing the backyard. They noticed that the house was cheap and had been empty for a year. But they didn't ask why. They just wanted to move. To make the house more lively, Mike got a pet. He brought an old parrot from the pet store. The store owner said the bird had been left behind by the last family to settle down. The bird's cage was placed next to the living room window. The bird didn't chirp or sing much at first. It was quiet and peaceful. At first the bird was silent. But after a few days they started talking. He didn't say random words like other parrots. Instead, he repeated strange phrases. "I see the watcher, he's over there," the bird said. The family thought the bird was just copying what his old owners had said. But then he started saying things like, "Don't look out the windows, the watcher can see you." He said again, "He's looking down." The bird mostly spoke at night, which disturbed the family. They wondered why the bird was only talking about the watcher. They started looking out the windows, but they didn't know what they were looking for. At night, the bird's voice was loud and filled the quiet rooms. Mike was intrigued and looked into the history of the house. He discovered that for over 20 years no family had stayed there for more than 4 months. All the families settled in quickly and didn't say why. Some left without taking everything. No one knew why. It was strange, but Mike still thought there was nothing to worry about. He also discovered something strange about the last owners. When they left, they told the neighbors that they were walking fast. The man who had lived there before them had suddenly left. The same thing had happened to the family before him. They all gave different reasons for living, but no one had stayed in the house. Neither family had given a clear reason for leaving, and neighbors said none of the previous families had returned. Mike thought it was strange, but he hadn't told his family. One night, Tommy woke up and ran to his parents' room. He looked scared. He told them he saw someone outside the window. The figure was tall and stood there staring. His parents thought it was just a bad dream, so they told him to go back to bed. But when they searched his room, there was nothing there. They looked through the window, but there was no one outside. The next day, Tommy didn't want to go into his room. He said he didn't like the window. Sarah and Mike tried to cheer him up, but he got nervous whenever they got close. Mike decided to check the signs outside, just in case. He scanned the floor and walls for anything that might explain Tom's story. He couldn't find any marks or footprints on the window, although Tom insisted that someone was there. Tommy didn't say much about it that night, but he seemed upset. But the next night, Tommy saw it again. According to him, it was the person watching him through the window. Tommy described it as very tall and quiet. He said it had no face, just a blank, pale surface. While he was talking about this, the bird began to talk again. He said, "The warden is there. The supervisor is waiting." Then Tom checked his window at night. He would look up and then quickly close the curtains. Sarah noticed him doing this and asked him why, but he would not say. The next night Tommy told her that he was too afraid to sleep by the window. He kept talking about the watcher. The bird's words, the stories of the tribe, and the empty house began to unsettle the family. Mike checked the house and made sure all the windows and doors were locked. But he was still nervous. Sarah searched the internet for stories about the watcher. He discovered some old legends. Some people said that the watcher was an invisible figure who looked in people's windows and forced them out of their homes. But he didn't find much else. It didn't make sense to him and he tried to ignore it. He couldn't find any real evidence that the watcher was real. But the more the bird talked about the watcher, the more anxious he became. One night the bird's expression changed. He began to say, "They can't find you." The bird repeated this several times, as if trying to warn them. Mike decided to stay awake all night in case something happened. At first the night was quiet and nothing happened. But before dawn Tom burst into their room again. He told his parents that he had seen the watcher again. He said the figure raised his hand as if to shake his hand. Tommy was very scared and wanted to leave the room. The family also started to feel scared. They felt that something was missing in the house and they couldn't explain it. They felt that they were being watched, but they couldn't see anyone. That night, Mike made a choice. Some things were packed and the family left the house to stay in a hotel. They weren't sure what was going on, but they didn't want to stay to find out. They never came back. They put the house up for sale and left the bird in a shelter. The family moved away and tried to forget about the strange things that had happened in that house. A few months later, a new family moved in. But like the others, they only stayed for a few months. Neighbors noticed that the house was still empty, waiting for another family to try to take over.
And so, the story ends. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and activate the bell button to receive all the stories. Like, share and rate the story in a comment. Thank you for watching.